I would say Crimea is up for grabs. And if Ukraine gets all the kit that it needs, that it's coming through now, it might be in a better position to do that. And if it gets, the Ukraine Iron Dome we've been talking about and gains air superiority, then yeah, again, it's another bit of the jigsaw, making it more likely. So I wouldn't write off Crimea at this stage. The very latest top secret ATACMS missiles, which are basically precision guided up to about 300 to 400 kilometers, are already in the theatre of warfare. So they already have those. We've already heard about them attacking airfields in Crimea. They are attacking depth positions in Russia, which is having an impact. The rest of it, again, we understand quite a lot of it is also positioned forward. So it should get there relatively quickly. And, but by gosh, it is needed. Very welcome. And of course, let's not forget also that Britain announced £500 million, £500 million worth of aid recently, which significantly included more Storm Shadow missiles. These are a bit like ATACMS, very long range, and very important that the Russians don't seem to be able to knock them down with their current air defense. So some significant things happening, but it is a very challenging picture that we're seeing in Ukraine at the moment.
And of what is included in the aid package, and we don't know the full shopping list, as it were, is it the ATACMS that you think will be the most crucial?
Well, the ATACMS are what we call a strategic weapon. In other words, they have the opportunity to hit strategic targets. These are targets that can have a demonstrative effect on the way that the Russian wages war, and particularly the sort of logistics support. So attacking the rail hubs, the roads, bridges. I think it's no secret that Ukraine intends to take out the Kerch Bridge, the main bridge from Russia into Crimea, where a lot of their military hardware flows. So that is why the ATACMS is so crucial. But also, it's just the amount of artillery ammunition and tank ammunition which Ukraine has been, really suffering with not having. I mean, the Russians are firing 10 artillery rounds to every one Ukrainian at the moment. And, as we've discussed before, and as we're seeing on the front, mass has a real quality of its own. And, although we thought this was sort of First World War type usage rates, actually the trench warfare in the Donbass is virtually similar, virtually no difference to the trench warfare in Passchendaele and the Somme, well over 100 years ago. So, yeah, just that weight of ammunition is key as well as the smart stuff.
Do you think we will see a major new Russian ground offensive in the coming weeks? There is a school of thought that they will try and do it in the next few weeks, partly because of the ground conditions, but also partly because all of the US military aid may not have been provided by that point.
Well, certainly what is happening on the front lines and has been happening over the last few months is a real concern. The Russians have got 600,000 troops, Alabite, not very well trained troops, but again, mass is important. And they are really pushing. We mentioned Avdiivka and Bakhmut, where they've made advances. In Avdiivka, they've made about 10 kilometers. Now, one of the concerning things that I have been writing about a lot in the last few weeks is they are the precursor to a lot of their attacks is a huge amount of use of CS gas, riot control agent, a sort of improvised chemical weapon. It does sound unbelievably simple and something we shouldn't be worried about, but actually it's having a huge impact. Reuters did an investigation, as did the Telegraph, really the extent of this. And in simple terms, by throwing a lot of CS gas into the Ukrainian trenches, the Ukrainian servicemen don't have respirators, or certainly don't have respirators, gas masks that actually work. So they're then abandoning the positions, and the Russians are following up with armored attacks and conventional attacks. And this is how they seem to be making ground. And that builds confidence in the Russians, and, it's morale sapping for the Ukrainians. So, and with the ground now drying out, there is a concern that in the short term, absolutely, the Russians might try and push really hard until some of that hardware goes. I think also very interesting to note this week that the Ukrainians have withdrawn some of their Western tanks from the front line, particularly the Abrams. First of all, because they have become under significant attack from these FPV drones, these very cheap $500 drones with sort of hand grenades on them that literally fly through open hatches. So that is a concern on the one hand, but I think it is probably more likely that Ukraine is trying to develop a mobile armored defense so that if there is a breakthrough, then they can counter it. But yeah, it's a tense time. If the Ukrainians can hold on for the next sort of month or so, then they should be restocked. And conversely, no doubt the Russians are looking at it. But I think the Russian ability to conduct what we call combined arms maneuver, that's tanks, that's air power and artillery and infantry all working together, is pretty limited because you need to train. This takes, if it was a British army, like when I was commanding the 1st Royal Tank Regiment, we did a year or 2 years of training before we'd go into the front line in somewhere like Iraq or Afghanistan. So what the Russians are doing, giving people a couple of days training, one's, not very confident that they can do this. But again, they will throw, as they call it, more soldiers into the meat grinder in the Donbass and hopefully make progress that way. So, yeah, I think the early summer, the next sort of 6 to 8 weeks are going to be crucial. And if Ukraine can hold on, then I think everybody's a bit more confident. But it could be touch and go. But one would expect to see the Ukrainians doing a lot more deep strike. We've discussed the ATACMS, we've discussed the Storm Shadow, and that really is, they can cut off the supply lines for the Russians, then the Russians will run out of ammunition. So, yeah, it's going to be a tense time. We'll need to watch it very closely.
It's really interesting what you said there, Hamish, about the Russian use of CS gas on the front line. What realistically could Ukraine do to counter that? I mean, does it fundamentally come down to the supply of things like gas masks?
Absolutely. There is a very simple solution to this. And actually in writing about it with support from the ex-Defence Secretary Ben Wallace and also Bob Seeley, another MP who's head of the Ukraine All-Party Group, we tried to be suggesting to the UK government that actually they could provide gas masks because that would end this threat. CS gas only lasts for a couple of minutes, but it is deeply unpleasant. And I've seen the use of basic toxic chemicals like chlorine in Syria being very, very effective. For an unprotected soldiers or unprotected civilians, it can be devastating. So that CS gas use could be countered if we could get, the right amount of gas masks to the front line in short order. And hopefully people are working on that. But let's not let the Russians off the hook here. This is viewed as a chemical weapon by the Chemical Weapons Convention. It is illegal under the Geneva Convention and the Chemical Weapons Convention, and it is in effect a war crime. And the Russians should be called out for using this dreadful weapon.
I want to ask you, Hamish, about how realistic you think it is for Ukraine to one day recapture Crimea. I was speaking yesterday on Frontline to Michael Binyon, who's been with the Times since 1972 as a foreign correspondent, columnist, leader writer. He knows his stuff, and he was quite pessimistic about Ukraine ever recapturing Crimea. And I put the counter argument that if you look at the success that Ukraine has had at eliminating much of the Black Sea Fleet, if you look at the way they've been targeting the Kerch Bridge, that actually it may not necessarily be out of the question. Where do you stand on that?
Well, this is a really interesting point. I think what Ukraine has done is, in military terms, we call it preparing the battlefield. So from a strategic perspective, preparing the battlefield to attack Crimea has gone pretty well. They have hit a lot of targets deep in Crimea, a lot of airfields, taken down a lot of some of the Russians' top fighter jets and bombers. They have made a lot of them move out of Crimea, and they've interdicted a lot of refineries, ammunition dumps, not only in Crimea but also in Russia. We know the Kerch Bridge is probably the Achilles heel of Russia. It's so much in the sights for Ukraine to attack, and so likely that it will do at some stage, that would really cut the head off the Crimea snake. Now, as you mentioned, the Black Sea Fleet has gone. There is virtually no naval presence in the Black Sea now. which gives Ukraine freedom of maneuver, which will be critical. The big question is, could they break through the Surovkin line, the defensive lines, which have been so difficult at the moment? And if they can, I think, yes, they certainly could take Crimea. And whether that will help quicken the end of the war or not is a case to consider. But I don't think taking Crimea is completely out of the question. And it could be a very key sort of element in the future to get some sort of meaningful peace. So yeah, I would say Crimea is up for grabs, and if Ukraine gets all the kit that it needs, that it's coming through now, it might be in a better position to do that. And if it gets the Ukraine Iron Dome we've been talking about and gains air superiority, then yeah, again, it's another bit of the jigsaw, making it more likely. So I wouldn't write off Crimea at this stage.
Key piece of information that's come out since this aid bill was passed is that the long-range US ATACMS had secretly been supplied to Ukraine and had been used on 2 occasions against a Russian airfield in Crimea on the 17th of April. And Russia's claiming to have shot down more destined to Crimea since. What kind of threat do they pose on the battlefield? And do you think this is a pattern that's going to be repeated, targeting Crimea?
Well, these ATACMS have a much longer range than the previous version that they were given last October. This version has a range out to about 300 kilometres. We're not quite sure which variants they were given, but it's probably a mix of the unitary warhead, which is one big warhead, and the cluster munition, which is lots and lots of sub-munitions. What this will permit the Ukrainians to do is target Russian operational targets. And when I say operational targets, these are targets that aren't engaged in direct combat now and aren't, back in Russia. They're somewhere in between. It's headquarters, it's logistics nodes, it's reserve troop locations. And the aim is to ensure if the Ukrainians do have to engage in ground combat, they're doing it in a much leveler playing field than what they're doing now, that they're able to kill as many Russians and destroy as much as their artillery before they're actually able to engage in ground combat, which is very similar to the air-land battle concept that NATO used in the Cold War.
So are we talking about potential targets deep inside Crimea, perhaps the Kerch Bridge as well?
Well, certainly most of Crimea can be held at risk. I think airfields, I think logistics nodes, Kerch Bridge might be part of that, headquarters, but also in southern and eastern Ukraine. So it allows the Ukrainians to target every square centimetre of their territory which is being occupied by the Russians, which was not the case before now. It's also worth noting that the ATACMS has some fairly clever trickery involved, which allows it to degrade the ability of Russian air defences to intercept them. So that's another reason why these things are very important in the Ukrainian armoury at the moment.
Right now, the Russians will know there's a small window before Ukraine reaps the benefits of this military aid arriving. What options will it be weighing up?
Well, it'll be weighing up, how much can it throw at the Ukrainians right now? I mean, it hasn't gone through another mobilisation process. We're expecting that they will, but they're still able to recruit 25 to 30,000. Generally replaces their losses and a little bit more. So they will be getting as many forces in combat as they can right now, while the Ukrainians are at what the Russians think, while the Ukrainians are at their weakest. We should recall, we thought the Ukrainians weren't going to hold out very long in 2022 and they achieved amazing things. So, we shouldn't be writing them off. But the Russians are doing things like moving first line parachute divisions, VDV units from the south to the east at the moment, which is an indication that the east will be their market, and it's where the Russians think they have the greatest chance of making some kind of significant breakthrough.
You're recently back from Ukraine, your 4th visit in 18 months. What can you tell us about your visit?
Well, I think I have to kind of say up front that I was there just before the US supplemental was passed. So my my insights, I guess, are guided by that. The Ukrainians are fatigued and frustrated at that point in time, particularly with the US Congress. But I think too that the last 6 months you've seen the counteroffensive fail. You saw the Zelensky civil military crisis. You saw the debate over the mobilisation bill, which has just been passed, but with thousands of amendments. I think after 27 months, fair enough, the Ukrainians are pretty fatigued, and it's hard to see a light at the tunnel at the moment that isn't a Russian armoured division. That is kind of the sense I got. It's not defeated. It's just, a grim realisation that this is going to take some time to win.
And as you say, it was before that momentous $61 billion US aid deal was passed and was agreed and signed off by President Biden. Can you just tell me a little bit more about what the purpose of your visit was? Who did you meet and what were you doing exactly?
Well, each of my visits have two purposes. One, to talk to a variety of military and government officials, as well as think tanks and journalists, to get a sense of where the war is and its potential trajectories. But the second purpose is about learning about Ukraine. I mean, it's a real revelation for me from the bottom of the world. Ukraine isn't a country a lot of Australians know a lot about. So it has a dual purpose every time. This time got to speak to pretty senior military and government officials at the ministerial level, National Security Advisor to President Zelensky, to get a fairly holistic view of where the war is at and where it might be trending at the moment.
And what did they tell you?
Well, they told us lots of different things, some things in confidence, something happy to share. But one of the important insights is, what is Ukraine's theory of victory? One of our senior interlocutors said, what does winning this look like for Ukraine? And I think that is an excellent question. It's probably a question only the Ukrainians can answer, but it's one that the West should help them with, both in formulating what that looks like and then helping them with the real resources to win it. We had some very interesting conversations with a Minister for Strategic Industries, very dynamic, a very competent minister who's really managed to turn around Indigenous defence production in Ukraine, tripled it in 2022, doubled it again last year. It's at the point now where they have more capacity than they can fund weapons for. So that's a pretty good place to be in. Most Western countries are nowhere near that in their defence production. And we had the opportunity to talk with a bunch of students at Kiev University to go to a very different kind of audience. Most of them were in uniform. You go to a Western university, that would never be the case. But in Ukraine, you have young students who are both training to be in the military and training their minds as university students. It kind of reminds you that this is a societal fight. It's not like the wars that I participated in, Iraq and Afghanistan, where a very small proportion of the country went back and did multiple tours and everyone else went on with their lives. Ukraine is a country that has been fundamentally changed because everyone, in some degree, is part of the war effort or has a relative who is.
When you say, Mick, that one of the interesting conversations you had was about what winning the war looked like with those senior figures, did you get a feeling of that there was a consensus of what that is?
Well, I think there's a consensus on the key elements. The most important bit is defeating Russia in Ukraine. The narrative from Western politicians that, we need to defend Ukraine or we're in it for as long as it takes, pretty meaningless. What we really need is a statement of intent, which is about beating Russia on the battlefield in Ukraine. It's not about defeating Russia as a nation or regime change or any of those things. It's about defeating Russia in Ukraine and Ukraine getting back to its 91 borders.
You also described this constant drumbeat of the escalation of terror by the West in this war. Their fear that sending some of the weapons that Ukraine needs at the time it crucially needs those weapons is in some way going to escalate in a way that we are fearful of. Has that attitude changed?
I'm not sure that it has. I think our risk tolerance might have increased a bit. I think The recent comments by French President Macron have been very interesting, and I really like that version of President Macron we're seeing at the moment, because he's probably the first Western leader that's kind of forced Putin to think, oh, wow, someone's talking about NATO boots on the ground. They haven't done that before. But all the way through this war, we've seen this escalation terror. It's like, well, we can't give them artillery, then we give them artillery. Oh, we can't give them tanks, then we give them tanks. I mean, we're going to do it. Let's just do it, and do it in a way that's speedy and allows this stuff to have an impact rather than kind of being a lagging capability. I think a really important indicator of how fearful some governments are of escalation at the moment is the most recent US statements that China has crossed a red line on the amount of dual-use technologies it's providing to Russia in this war, and that it has to stop it. So I think, we'll see out of the Biden administration, is it willing to put its money where its mouth is with China crossing those red lines, or is it going to take the Obama administration approach, lays out red lines, and when the adversary crosses them, it just looks the other way?
What kind of action would you like the Biden administration to take if China does continue to cross those red lines in supporting Russia?
Well, I think there's more it can do on the technology front. You got to wonder how many other American companies might be dissuaded from dealing with, although a lot of them at the moment are leaving of their own volition because of some of the laws that China brought in the last few years. So, the Americans are probably going to have to be pretty creative in this, because as we've seen, sanctions against Russia have hurt them a bit, but they haven't had the full impact that we'd hoped they would. I think too that, the US will be looking at those who export other high technologies to China and might be twisting some arms there. But at the end of the day, it'll be up to the Biden administration to decide whether it wants to act Chinese across these red lines.
And then, of course, whatever comes afterwards, after November. Finally, something that's very pertinent to you, the potential expansion of the AUKUS military partnership of Australia, the UK and US to include South Korea as a Pillar 2 partner. As I understand it, that would not mean it's not involved in the provision of conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarines, but more the development of things like hypersonic missiles, underwater drones, cyber technology. This, of course, is deplored by President Xi. What effect do you think this potential expansion will have in the region, and why is it expanding?
I think it'd be a great move. And of course the Chinese would hate it because they want to deal with each country individually. They don't want to deal with alliances because they know together we're much stronger than them. We saw recent speculation that Japan might join the elements of AUKUS. I think that would be a fabulous move. They have an enormously sophisticated, broad and deep research and development capacity that outstrips Australia, certainly, potentially Britain as well. They would bring an enormous amount to AUKUS Pillar 2. And let's not forget, they've been a very responsible international citizen for many, many decades since the end of the Second World War. I think Korea are in the same boat. They're a responsible international citizen. Both Australia and the US in particular have very close and significant trading relationships with Korea. I think for Australia, it's our second or third largest trading partner. And once again, they have a very sophisticated R&D capacity, and they design and build their own submarines, warships, aircraft, armoured vehicles. So I think they bring a lot to it. Really, it gets down to the security around that sharing of technology. But politically, I think it makes all the sense in the world.
I said, and finally, but I just have one last question. To what extent do you think what is happening in Ukraine right now and how the next 12, 24 months roll out will impact the security and what happens and the attitudes to your part of the world?
I think it has a few impacts. First and foremost, you're seeing Ukraine as a huge battle lab for new technologies that are going to spin off all over. One example is we saw Iran use exactly the same kind of tactics against Israel a couple of weeks ago that Russia's been using with its drone and missile attacks against Ukraine. That's just one example. I think you'll see other examples when it comes to information warfare, the use of drones and things like that. Now, Ukraine and the Indo-Pacific, very different terrain, weather, geography and politics. But I think there are enough lessons there about leadership, about strategic decision-making, about industrial bases that they will translate into the Indo-Pacific very well.
There have been symbolic attacks on Moscow. We've had drones that have actually hit buildings and done something, but we haven't had widespread casualties or anything like that. And I don't think the average Russian does really feel that the war is all around them. Of course, the average young person does worry that any moment now they may be recruited into the military, and that is a very real threat. And particularly the elite youth, as it were, in Moscow and Petersburg, either they've fled or they're hoping that the military recruitment will not pick them up, because that could cause a lot of upset in influential places.
And do you think Putin will do that at some point, or do you think he'd be reluctant to because of the internal unrest it would cause if he does, for example, conscript younger, more middle class people, from the big cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg?
Well, so far he has been very reluctant to do that, which suggests he would still be reluctant. It depends how urgently they need more forces. Depends how reckless they are with their own casualties. I mean, they have a very poor record of saving lives on the front line. They just throw in wave after wave. I mean, some of them, they say, well, these were prisoners. These were people who they took the bargain. They would be free if they joined up and fought on the front line, and they got killed. Well, that was their choice, as it were. They are trying to induce people into the armed services by paying enormous amounts of money. I mean, 6 times the average wage for those who join up, and promises to their families if they are killed or if they are injured. Well, that may keep up some the flow of recruits, but actually military conscription, a new wave of conscription, Putin has been reluctant to do that, and it depends how tough the situation gets for Russia, whether they will or need to do that.
We have heard since the start of the full-scale invasion fears about Putin potentially using tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, fears about some major escalation. So far, that hasn't come to pass. How would you assess that risk?
Yes, well, the risk is there, but I think the Russians are under pretty strict restrictions, both from their main ally, China, who's warned them several times publicly as well as privately, don't you think of using nuclear weapons, because the Chinese know that then World War III starts, or, absolutely uncontrollable consequences if they start doing that. And equally, I think public opinion within Russia would be very hostile to the idea of nuclear weapons that could expose Russians also to a counterattack. Now, as for the Germans feeling that they are getting involved by having people on the ground helping man these missiles, well, that is a perfectly real fear, and it's not unreasonable, because actually several countries have clandestinely put their own experts on the ground to help Ukraine either train or use or launch or do whatever they need to do with weapons with which the Ukrainians are not familiar. And there have been reports that there are quite a number of undercover Western military advisors, or actually experts on the ground with the Ukrainians. The Russians are well aware of that. The Russians have tried to stop that by bombing supply lines or targeting ammunition dumps where these things are delivered inside Ukraine. But it's a bit difficult for them, because the Western governments have all denied that they're officially entering into a direct armed association with Ukraine. They're saying we're simply supplying, what they need in terms of weapons and defense. But inevitably, there are people on the ground.
Yeah. And I suppose the crucial question is it possible for Ukraine to win this war without escalating the conflict?
That's a very good question. I mean, it depends how you define winning. Is it possible for them to get back all the territory now occupied by Russia? Frankly, the answer is no. It's not going to happen. They're not going to get the Russians particularly out of Crimea. And actually, I'm not sure, for all their talk, whether the West really will push Ukrainians into full-scale war to the point where they've got the Russians retreating back behind the 2014 frontiers, in other words, withdrawing from Crimea. The West was fairly mute when the Russians occupied Crimea, partly because there was a sort of feeling that Crimea actually, historically, has always been Russian. It was only in 1954 that Khrushchev signed it over to Ukraine. And in those days, it didn't matter. It was all the same country. It was all part of the Soviet Union. So there isn't that sort of feeling that Ukraine must go on all the way to win. Now, victory could mean less than getting all the territory back. It could mean simply showing Moscow that they have failed in their objective of subordinating the entire country to Moscow, that most of Ukraine is free and independent and will not necessarily do what Moscow wants. And that could be a real definition of victory, and it could indeed be very damaging to Putin.
Is it unrealistic, though, for Ukraine to recapture Crimea? Because there would be some who say, look at the success that Ukraine, a country essentially without a navy, has had at eliminating much of the Black Sea fleet. Obviously, it's targeted the Kerch Bridge in the past. If they were able to destroy or partially destroy the Kerch Bridge, that would be a severe blow to Russia. Is it really out of the question they could retake Crimea?
No, it's not out of the question. I just think it's politically more difficult for them to persuade the Allies to back them to a full-scale assault, getting all Russian forces out of Crimea. You're right, they have had enormous success, unexpected success almost, in their naval operations. They've managed to target Russian ships, they've sunk quite a few, they've forced the Russians to withdraw from the ports in Crimea, Sevastopol in particular, move further east to Russian ports the other side of the water there. I think that the Russians would double down enormously if they really thought that Crimea itself was actually about to be retaken. I think they would launch everything they've got to make sure that doesn't happen. But in terms of being able to hit Russian forces, the Ukrainians have been quite successful, particularly with their longer-range missiles, at hitting ammunition dumps, at hitting strategic supply points, and also Russian bases.
And tactically, do you think we will see that continue from Ukraine, particularly with the provision now of these ATACMS again from the US, that they will go after some of the energy infrastructure that Russia has, whilst obviously trying to defend their positions on the front line?
Undoubtedly. I mean, that would be the sensible thing to do. I mean, I'm sure that's what their military advisors would tell them to do. And they need to target the airfields and the bases where a lot of Russian attacks are launched from. They need to actually hit energy infrastructures in the same way that the Russians have done and are still doing in Ukraine. Yes, but of course, again, you get to the point where, to what extent are the Western allies ready to allow the Ukrainians to use Western weapons for direct assaults on Russia proper beyond the territory that has been occupied? Are they ready for long-range hits, say on Moscow or wherever they might try to bomb? I think the answer is the West would be fairly reluctant.
But wouldn't that bring things to a head in a way that may work out in Ukraine's favour? Because, you know, at the moment, for many ordinary Russians, the war feels quite distant. It doesn't affect their day-to-day lives. If there were regular strikes on big Russian cities, surely that would increase the pressure internally on Putin.
Yes, well, I can tell you about one city in particular that I know quite well, namely Belgorod, down in the south, where I have spent several years teaching English to students in Belgorod. A lovely city. It's a sort of medium-sized town, neither rich, neither poor, neither big, neither small. It's a typical, quite well-to-do southern town, and they have had attacks on them, and people have been killed, and they are quite worried and upset and scared, and it does come home to them very much in a big way there.
Trump's central argument, actually, that he's been making over recent years, although he's been making it in very crass terms, is right, is it not, that actually America for too long has basically funded Europe's defence policy, and European countries, particularly NATO members, need to spend more of their overall spending on defence. And we're starting to see moves in that direction. But Trump is right on that point, isn't he?
Oh, yes. I think there's no question about that. The Europeans have all heard that message and reacted to it. That's not quite the same as helping Ukraine. I mean, what Trump is saying is that European membership of NATO is dependent on them paying their share. And even if they pay 2% or more than 2%, even then, America will still pay by far the largest share of the running costs of NATO and all the equipment and, well, everything. America will still have a much larger share, and in absolute terms, a far higher amount of money will be paid in by the Americans. But the Europeans have heard that message, and they've been saying it themselves. We really ought to up our game a bit, and particularly those that are below 2%, which include big countries such as Germany.
Yeah.
I mean, Germany's made a big commitment that they will increase their defense budget, but, it needs to be increased pretty quickly. And then some other countries that have really thought that defense doesn't matter terribly much, countries that have sort of fairly far away and fairly peaceful. Well, for example, Spain and Portugal, or even some of the southern European countries in NATO, they don't see the urgency or haven't seen the urgency. But I think they will see it now. The only countries that have really seen it, and have seen it for some time, are those in Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
Close to Poland, for example, spends far more.
3.9%, I think.
Well,
they're spending
exactly.
now, yeah.
Almost double what Britain pays, not in terms of money, but in terms of per percentage per head.
Yeah.
That is a lot, and they see the urgency straight away. And Britain has always been fairly far out front, but I have to say, even Britain's contribution has relatively declined in the past 10 or 15 years. The peace dividend, as it was called, seems to have been that the army is well below force. We've got real problems with equipment. We haven't got enough. We've not manufactured things that work. We've been spending a lot of money on tanks that make all those in it go deaf. So, not very successful record so far.
Russian sources have claimed that Ukraine conducted a short-range ATACMS strike against targets in Crimea on Monday night. Do you see Crimea as the soft underbelly of Russia's war effort? That if you can undermine Crimea, if you can destroy or damage further the Kerch Bridge, if you can continue to strike targets in Crimea, that is where Putin is at his weakest?
Absolutely. Currently, there's two soft underbellies of the Russian Empire. One is Bryansk, Kursk, Belgorod, those regions, because whenever they launch missiles at Ukrainian citizens from the territory of Belgorod, for example, they receive a response, and people who live in Belgorod, they realize that it's a game that two parties can play, right? And it's as dangerous to shoot Ukrainians for themselves as well. And this is why they react. And basically, we really hope that they will be wise enough to call their authorities to stop this insanity. But unfortunately, with Russia, it's not the case. And of course, the second soft underbelly is Crimea, because we know that with losing Crimea, Putin will most probably lose his life as well. That's why these strikes on strategic objects will continue. And of course, we expect that with the Ukrainian army gaining access to Azov Sea, at least, the future of so-called Russian Crimea will be under big question. So, yes.
And on the tactics that we've seen from Ukraine of late, have you noticed any significant shift in tactics since General Starsky replaced General Zaluzhny, or have they been following, broadly speaking, the same tactical objectives?
Well, currently we are talking about defensive actions, about active defense, and it didn't change much. So because of the ammunition starvation, let's call it this way, we don't have much choice but to defend our positions, and if we cannot do that, we should slowly move back, inflicting as much casualties to the Russian personnel as possible. This is exactly what we saw in places like Avdiivka, for example, and this is what we see in several other spans of the front line. Not much time passed, I think, to talk about the differences in tactics, but at the same time, the commanders of the brigades, on the level of brigades, they're the same. They didn't change. They know their location. They know their ground. and I don't think that we will see any dramatic changes in the current tactics.
You mentioned Avdiivka there. Obviously, we have seen further incremental gains by the Russians in and around Avdiivka over recent weeks. How concerned are you about that?
There were several concerning cases recently, but with aid coming to the Ukrainian defenders, I'm sure that we will be able to deal with them.
How would you say morale is among Ukrainian troops at the moment?
Well, again, because of this American aid was approved, the morale is boosting, the morale is rising, which is good. I talked to different guys. They all say that we cannot wait until we receive our howitzers or shells. So the other problem is, of course, exhaustion of the troops, because I keep saying this, the guys keep fighting for more than 2 years already, and they feel exhausted. But this is the price we have to pay for our freedom, I think.
And just finally, Operator Starsky, I asked this question of Hamish to Bretton Gordon yesterday, and I'll ask it of you as well, because I think it's insightful. What would constitute a successful May? We're speaking now at the start of May. What would constitute a successful month of May for Ukraine?
End of the war. We all expect this war to end tomorrow, like literally. But realistically speaking, of course, we understand that it's impossible, and it will end in several more years, which is more realistic. We know that Russia is capable of fighting for the next 2 or 4 years, according to different sources, like Institute for Studying Warfare, for example. Successful May for us is, I think, probably increasing defense on our positions, building new lines of defenses, because this is something very important and cannot be ignored, and then concentrating new resources for a new counteroffensive.
Even though things have been incredibly stretched for Ukraine on the front line, given the lack of supplies in recent months, Ukraine has still had remarkable success at using long-range missiles to target some of those Russian energy infrastructure pieces.
Yeah, and not only missiles, also drones. Another thing that we have to mention here is that, of course, Ukraine uses plenty of different types of drones on a tactical level, on operative level, but Russians also use electronic warfare machines to suppress those drones, and this is why artillery, like primitive common artillery, is so much useful at the front lines to strike Russian personnel and Russian vehicles and ammo storages and command posts.
How long do you think it will be until the full impact of this fresh US military aid is actually felt in Ukraine?
I think it depends on the time of delivery of this aid to our positions on the first place, because there's already a plan developed for our further steps, right? We only need tools to make it happen. So I think the first question is delivery, and this is where we have to expect actions from Russian invaders who will obviously try to disrupt our logistics and our attempts to supply this aid to our guys on the front line.
And I think what we're all hoping is that the West has not become complacent now that this military aid package has been approved by US Congress. Hopefully it'll make a big difference, but alone it is not enough, and there needs to be more. And I'm wondering in particular whether you think, for example, Germany granting access to the Taurus missiles could be the kind of thing that could actually make a further difference in Ukraine?
I think Germany could have done it already, right? If they had political will, and if I'm talking about Mr. Scholz, of course, if he had political will, he would do that already. But we don't see that, unfortunately, and something tells me that it will never happen. We won't see Taurus missiles in Ukraine. We will see, I believe, other kinds of support and military aid. There are already factories being built, factories for producing artillery shells, because luckily our allies realized that this is very important nowadays for Ukrainian defenders. But unfortunately, this takes a lot of time. But on the other hand, because our allies, comparing to Russia, even that produces plenty of shells on a daily basis, but they are very strong and they have very powerful economy, again, comparing to Russia, and they will be able to do that.
Just on the Taurus missiles, one of the arguments that Olaf Scholz makes against providing them is he says it would be an escalation, not only because of how they might be used by Ukraine against Russia, but also because he believes it would require German soldiers to be on the ground in Ukraine helping to program the missiles. Now, I know some analysts have disputed that and said that actually you wouldn't need German soldiers on the ground. Do you think that Ukraine has the expertise already within its forces to program the missiles themselves?
Well, since we're building our own missiles, like Neptune, for example, those missiles that destroyed Russian flagship Moskva in the Black Sea, of course we have capability to program foreign missiles as well. The problem is lack of political willpower, right? If you really want to do something, you're looking for opportunity. If you don't want to do something, you're looking for reason to justify you not doing it. And this is exactly what we can see, because we already heard a lot of different reasons, from Ukrainians not being able to program those missiles to, I don't know, technologies getting in the hands of Russians and things like that. We must, I think, we must understand that probably there is no will to pass those missiles to Ukraine for whatever reason, but I think it will not happen.
And when you hear allies of Ukraine in the West make the argument about not wanting to provoke Russia and escalate things further, what do you make of that when you hear that argument? Because, of course, it's very easy for someone who is not living in a country that's currently being illegally occupied to make that argument. And yet, it is a legitimate point that no one wants to see Vladimir Putin use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, for example. So when you hear people talk about the risk of escalation and not wanting to provoke Russia further, what do you make of that?
There are two opinions. One opinion is like escalation is general, and it's one of the Russian narratives that are being spread on the West. It's like Russians and Ukrainians killing each other. We should stop escalation because they are killing each other. Ukrainians are defending because it's a proper thing to defend your home. You don't want to die because somebody just wants to kill you. He doesn't have that right. Nobody has. We all have right to live, and we have right to protect ourselves. This is why we are fighting. And another opinion is, of course, related to use of nuclear weapons, because people are afraid that if there is a chance that Russian army will be engaged in direct combat against NATO troops, this will inevitably lead to a nuclear war. On the other hand, considering the intensity of talks about using nuclear weapons on a Russian television. And all the attempts to scare the West, I think they understand the price of this, and they will never do that, of course.
The foreign aid bill, which passed in the US, includes $2 billion towards the foreign military financing program for Taiwan and other security partners. China says it's pushing the island into a dangerous situation. Is it? And how might China respond?
Well, this is a situation that's been going on for some time, and the $2 billion you just referred to is simply the latest installment in a very substantial series of aid packages that the United States has provided to Taiwan in recent years. When the United States recognized the People's Republic of China, they canceled a bilateral treaty with Taiwan that effectively required them to provide security for Taiwan, but they introduced to Taiwan another act which committed the US government to providing Taiwan with military equipment for defensive purposes. That was something that didn't cause, obviously China was not happy with it, but it didn't really cause too much problem. I think the issue came into stark relief around 2017, 2018 under the Trump administration, which began to use Taiwan as a means of putting pressure on China and creating irritation. The Trump administration, I think, provided in total $18 billion worth of military assistance to Taiwan, though it must be said that because of delivery lags, a lot of that equipment hasn't arrived yet. And the Biden administration has similarly provided a range of military equipment to Taiwan. So this $2 billion really is the most recent installment. And in a sense, I think we can say that China's objections to this latest tranche are, in some senses, pro forma. But what I think they will do is to continue and perhaps intensify what they've already been doing for 6 or 7 years now, which is an intensification of what have been termed gray zone tactics. Flights over the so-called median line, the sort of midway line in the Taiwan Strait that divides the two entities, a lot of military exercises, naval exercises in the Taiwan Strait and around Taiwan, cyber attacks, information operations, cognition warfare. All of these things have been going on. And
it's widely regarded, though, that China would be militarily ready to invade Taiwan by 2027. How far is it prepared to go, in your opinion, to exert its claim over the island?
That, in a sense, when they say that they are prepared to resort to military force to recover the island, one has to take this seriously. At the same time, it's quite clear that for now, at least, the Chinese government is more focused on peaceful reunification with Taiwan. This is not straightforward because the party that has governed Taiwan for the last 8 years and will continue to do so when the presidential handover takes place later this month, have been regarded by China as promoting Taiwan independence, which for China has always been a red line. But in the recent elections in Taiwan that took place in January this year, we saw a situation in which the Democratic People's Party, the DPP, the governing party, retained the presidency but lost control of the legislature, with a lot of people splitting their votes precisely in order to bring about this outcome. So I think China will look at the political situation in Taiwan and think, well, if the two main opposition parties had done what they set out to do and agreed on a unity candidate, which ultimately failed to materialize, they would actually have won the election. And at least one of these parties, the Kuomintang, the KMT, is much more amenable, at least to talking to China about reunification, whereas, of course, the DPP is not. The other thing, to pick up on what you said about China being militarily ready by 2027 to take Taiwan, I think we need to make a distinction here between capability and intent. On the one hand, and secondly, to recognize that while by 2027 the Chinese military might actually have most of the equipment that they would need to undertake what would be a very difficult operation, they're still not sure that they've, so to speak, got the software right. The personnel, the military training, the ability to put together complex integrated joint operations, logistics, all of these things. I think they have reservations still about their own capabilities in this regard.
Your assessment right now is that China does not have the intent. It wants to achieve its ambitions via diplomatic means without violence at this stage.
Yes, I mean, when China looks at the whole Taiwan situation, their military planning is based on a presumption that the United States will come to Taiwan's aid militarily in the event of conflict. The United States posture has been one of strategic ambiguity, leaving it open whether or not they would undertake such activity. But President Biden has, in the last couple of years, said on 4 occasions that the U.S. would come to Taiwan's assistance in such an event. So I think you've got to take that seriously. And of course, China obviously is concerned about the very real risks of getting into a shooting war with the United States. It's not necessarily the case that they would lose this war, but equally, it's not necessarily the case they would win it. Wars these days tend not to have quick and decisive conclusions, and what China could find itself getting into is a prolonged conflict of uncertain outcome. And I think Xi Jinping and any eventual successor, if it doesn't happen under Xi Jinping, would be very concerned about the impact of that on the ability of the Chinese Communist Party to retain its hold on power. Not to mention the...
What do you make then of reports that have been in a British national newspaper this week that China is stockpiling gold? It's raised suspicions that this is perhaps sanction-proofing itself against the US. What do you read into that?
Possible, but I think you have to remember that the Chinese Communist Party is a quintessentially paranoid organization and kind of needs to be. This is in their DNA, so to speak. And for a long time now, Xi Jinping has been talking to the Chinese people about the need for struggle, the need to be aware of threats. He has identified over 20 areas which apply to national security. Just recently, China had its National Security Day when they seek to raise the awareness of the population about the threats that China faces. Xi Jinping has also talked about a very much more difficult and complex international situation. The United States government is now threatening to sanction some Chinese banks who are seen as having facilitated the sale of to Russia of equipment that Russia is using to rebuild its military capabilities. So I think that the Chinese government is looking to maximize its resilience in the face of threats and interruptions. By the same token, Xi Jinping is making a big thing of China achieving self-sufficiency in food production, energy, and so on. So I think this is just another manifestation of that general sense of paranoia.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.